Okay, so this is sort of complicated because on the one hand, the first time that like I officially started hearing voices was when I was 17 and I was in high school, and I it was the first time I'd smoked marijuana, and I was walking through a parking lot and I heard someone call my name, and I turned around and there was no one there. And then after that, I started to hear a whole bunch of different voices, a voice narrating things, a negative voice, and then eventually the voice of God and stuff. But, however, when I was a child, I had some experiences that I would probably now classify as hearing voices, where but at the time I was like, oh, it's the Holy Spirit, or it's like, demons or whatever. So it's hard for me to say exactly when the voices began because, like, I was like diagnosed as like having auditory hallucinations when I was like 17, but I sort of had some experiences before then that at the time I was just like, these are just normal experiences.
Tell me about the experiences you had when you were a young child.
Well, it's really interesting because a lot of them were like giving me commands, but it was like mundane commands, like for example, refill the water jug, or give money to like a homeless person, or tell your mother that you love her, or so stuff like that. So with the Holy Spirit, those were the type of commands. So it was never this like the stuff when I got older. It was never stuff like negative stuff like telling me to harm myself or to harm other people. So it was more of like a positive sort of experience.
Um, what are some of the different voices which you hear or have heard? How would you characterize and describe them?
Well, the first voice that I started hearing when I was 17 was this voice that was like narrating everything. That's what it did at first. And I called the voice Charlotte. And so Charlotte narrated stuff, and like for example, would say, "You are staring at a blue towel." And I would be like, "No, I'm staring at a gray towel actually." But like that was the extent of how much I got annoyed with it, was because sometimes the voice was wrong in what it described. And then the second voice, which I called Sid, cropped up, and Sid was very mean both to Charlotte and to me, and would like be like, "Oh, you're so stupid, that's so wrong," like and then would tell me that I should kill myself and I should jump in front of the SkyTrain, and tell me that I was worthless and so on. So that was what happened there. And then the big shift that happened in hearing voices for me was when I started hearing the voice of God, which happened after I made this deal, because I was an atheist at the time, but I really wanted to go to York University in Toronto. And so I made this deal and I said, "God, if you exist, if you can get everything to work out and I get housing and everything so I can go to York University, I'll reconsider whether or not I believe that God exists." And it was after that, everything worked out because I was having all these problems with getting housing and stuff. And then suddenly I got housing and everything was fine. And then after that, I started to hear the voice of God. Like the first thing I heard it say was my name. So I just heard a voice saying, Bradley. And then I was like, it sounded different than the other voices. Like one way I described it, and I go to this support group for people who hear voices, and one way I described it was that it sounded like rainbows, it sounded like metallic. It was an interesting sort of sound, the way the voice sounded. And anyways, then after that, I started to hear the voice of God all the time, and it would tell me to not eat pork, not to swear, not to say, "Oh my God," and told me to write down things in books and stuff. And it told me, for example, that it was okay with me being transgender, that God was fine with that. So it was mostly a positive experience with that voice. And then I had a sort of traumatic experience where I was like, the police came and brought me to the hospital because I'd gone off my medication, because I thought it would bring me closer to God to go off my medication. And I was feeling suicidal, and so they brought me to the hospital and they put me in a seclusion room, and I had a really bad experience, and the next day I attempted suicide. And then after that, when I was in the seclusion room, I didn't hear the voice of God at all anymore. And then about 10 months later or something, I had this vision where I saw God, and it was completely different from the sort of benign voice of God that I had heard. I had this vision where I saw God, and he was like, he said that I have to kill the next president of the United States. And at the time, I didn't know who that was going to be, but like I was like, I don't know, I don't want to do that, and so that happened, and so then I was scared because I kept having these visions of the end of the world. Like I would see a street, and then I would see, like overlaid over top of that, like a destroyed version of that street with like the buildings destroyed and like things on fire and stuff like that, and I would just see, because the vision of God that I saw was based sort of off this patient I met in the hospital who said that he was God. So I would see that patient standing there wearing the hospital pajamas and just smiling, in the middle of like all this, destruction, and so I would have these visions, and so then that really freaked me out, and then eventually the benign voice of God returned. And so now I'm sort of like, well, which one of them is really God? And like, if one of them is really God, and like, so, and then what is the visions of God if it's not God? And so that's sort of where I'm at.
What was it that made you believe the voice was God when you first heard it?
Well, one of the things that made me believe, because I kind of sort of believed almost instantly, but what made me believe was I had my phone, the camera wasn't working on my phone. And one day the voice told me to go into the forest, and so I went to the forest, and the voice gave me these messages, and then the voice said, I will give you a sign that I'm actually God. Take out your phone and take a picture, and your camera will work. And I'm like, it's not going to work because it's broken. But I took out my phone, and I took a picture, and it worked fine. And from then on, my camera worked. And then when I stopped hearing the voice of God for a while, the camera on my phone stopped working again. And so that was sort of what made me believe, was because I was like, oh, that's like tangible proof. That's not just something that I hear or that I see. And another thing that happened was, before I made the deal with God, I had this dream where I saw Jesus. I was in the psych ward because I'd had this like extended several month long like breakdown, where I thought the world was ending, and I was getting all these signs and stuff. And what happened was, I was in the psych ward, and in the dream I was just sitting in the psych ward, and then one day, like as I was sitting there, Jesus just came in like through the roof, and like I just like took his hand, and I was just like flying through the sky, and I saw what I thought was heaven. And then Jesus said to me, everyone will be saved. And then later, it's interesting, because with several things the voices say, like I look them up, and like I looked up, everyone will be saved, and there's a Bible verse that says everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, which sounds sort of similar. And another thing that happened was the voices said that you will walk through the fire and you will not be burned. And it turned out that when I looked that up, that was also another Bible verse. That one was in the Old Testament. So that's sort of something that happens sometimes, is the voices will say something and I won't know it, and then they know something that I don't.
What is your understanding of how or why these voices, as well as visions, end up in your head?
So I sort of have like several models for understanding them. The first model I had for understanding them when I first started hearing voices was the biomedical model, which is the idea that there is a chemical imbalance in my brain, and if I took medication, the voices would go away. But the problem that happened was that I kept taking my medication, and I tried about like 10 different antipsychotics, and the voices didn't go away. A thing that actually happened with the voice of God is when I went on loxapine, the voice got louder and stronger, and like I was hearing it more. So they kept upping the dose of my loxapine. I started out at like 15 milligrams, and I was at 100 milligrams. And at 100 milligrams of loxapine, the voice was like still going strong and would not go away. So then I started to feel like, with the thing that happened with my phone and the dream that I had, I started to feel like I was really hearing the voice of God, and that God was actually talking to me. So that was my explanation for it. But then I still had the other voices that were very negative, telling me to kill myself and stuff. And so I felt like, not all the voices I was hearing were coming from God. And so I became interested in some writings of some influential psychologists in the hearing voices movement who talk about the idea that life stressors and traumatic events can cause people to hear voices. And I read different studies about how people who had been sexually abused as children, or physically abused, or had gone to war and come back would hear voices, related to their trauma. And I've experienced traumatic events in my life, so that was interesting to me as like a possible explanation for why I heard some of the negative voices. And I should mention that my psychiatrist's current theory is that I have borderline personality disorder, and now he thinks that the borderline personality disorder causes the voices, which I think is an important distinction to make, because I've had psychiatrists in the past who would tell me, you have borderline personality disorder, so you're pretending to hear voices, but you don't really hear voices. So they told me I was faking the voices for attention. But my psychiatrist believes I actually do hear voices, but the voices that I hear are related to the 9th criteria of borderline personality disorder, which is transient stress-related paranoid ideation and severe dissociative symptoms. So he believes that my voices are caused by stress, and when I get really stressed out, then I start to... the voices get worse, because I'm always hearing voices whether I'm stressed or not. So the theory would be that the stress sort of causes the voices to get worse, and so then the result of that is to learn to better manage stress and my emotions. And at first I was very skeptical of that theory, because I was like mostly because most psychiatrists had told me that I had borderline personality disorder and I was faking my symptoms, so I was skeptical that anyone would believe that I had symptoms that were caused by borderline personality disorder. But I did read one thing that was interesting to me, not necessarily convincing, but interesting to me, was that I read online, someone was saying that medications tend not to work for people who hear voices who have borderline personality disorder. That doesn't affect their symptoms as much when they have hallucinations or voices. And so I thought that was sort of interesting as like a possible explanation, but I don't necessarily adhere to it as like the complete total explanation for everything that I've experienced. And then for the visions of God, I feel strongly that I am communicating with a real entity, but whether or not that entity is God or is like a benevolent entity, I don't feel so certain of. I feel like maybe I'm communicating with a sort of more malicious entity like Satan or something, but I do feel like I'm communicating with a real entity that, and it's hard to explain why, because I don't have any evidence like the thing that happened with my phone. I just have sort of this feeling of that it feels very real when I have the visions. Like it feels like I'm really seeing this other world. And I also feel like the visions, they predicted that Donald Trump would become president. So that was another case of like them having information that like I didn't have.
How if it's when you say that you're communicating with another entity, is it possible that this is just a chemical reaction in your brain which is creating the entity, or do you believe that it's somehow outside your brain?
Well, I feel like it's like a real entity outside my brain. At this point, I feel like I basically feel unsure, sort of like everything with the voices. Like, there was a point, like when I first started hearing voices, and I got a bunch of different diagnoses, like over a dozen different diagnoses, and I was kept waiting for the one diagnosis that would explain everything, and then it would explain why I had my symptoms, and it would fit perfectly, and then I would take a medication and the medication would work, and I just thought it would all fit together perfectly. And now I've come to this point in my life where like I don't feel like that's going to happen, not just with diagnosis but also with alternative explanations for why I hear voices. I feel like I'm always going to kind of be a little bit confused and uncertain as to why I hear voices, and I won't know for sure of, is this a real entity that's outside my brain or is this a chemical reaction? I feel like I'm going to kind of, some days I feel more strongly, maybe this is a chemical reaction and my medication is keeping it at bay. And other days I'm going to feel more strongly, well, this is just a psychological reaction to stress. And then other days I'll feel more strongly, this is a genuine entity with which I'm communicating, which is from like another planet or another dimension or something. So yeah.
Tell me more about that. If this is an entity or entities which are from communicating to you through some technology or through another dimension.
Yeah.
Why would they have chosen you to speak to?
That's an interesting question, and that's when I was hearing the voice of God. That was a question that was posed to me by my psychiatrist and my case manager at the time, which is different than my current case manager and psychiatrist. And they said, why would God want to speak to you? God would want to speak to someone important, like the president. Like, you're not important, why would God want to speak to you? And I, though I may not carry a lot of the religious beliefs I used to have when I was younger, one belief that I found very positive that I was raised believing is that God will speak to anyone. And if you look in the Bible, you'll see that he talks according to the accounts of the Bible, like he picks people who aren't high in social status often, like to become prophets or to speak to. So there's sort of the idea that God will speak to anyone if they're willing to listen to him. Now, as for malevolent entities that are sort of speaking to me, why would they choose to harass me? That is something I have thought about, because what if sort of like my first psychotic episodes that I sort of had, it wasn't really like a full psychotic episode because it lasted for like a day. It was very much like a mini psychotic episode, and it was triggered by me taking too much of my clonazepam, and I heard the voice of Satan, and the voice of Satan was telling me that I was the Antichrist, and I did a lot of crazy things that day. I had long fingernails, and I lit my fingernails on fire while they were still attached to me. I cut some words into my arm. Like, I went into the forest and I burned my medication on like an altar. So like I was like freaking out, and then I called 911 because I was like so freaked out by everything that I had just done. And they didn't admit me to the hospital because the psychiatrist said, oh, you have borderline personality disorder, so you think you have these symptoms, but you don't have these symptoms. And I was very frustrated because it had been a very terrifying experience for me. But then afterwards, when I thought about it, I was like, why would Satan just pick like some random teenager to like, I'm just going to mess with this teenager. I'm going to like talk to them and be like, hey, you're the Antichrist. So I was like, well, sort of, why me? And so I sort of think about that and I've like said that when I've gotten into arguments with like the visions that I have, when they're like, we need you to do this, or we need you to do that, or else the world will end. Like, we need you to kill the president. And I'll be like, well, why did you pick me? Isn't there anyone else you could have picked? Like, if this needs to happen, why did you pick me? And they're like, because you're useful to us, because you'll do what we say, because we love you. Like, they give various conflicting answers, but I don't really know. I mean, it's sort of strange if you think about it, but one of my favorite science fiction authors is Philip K. Dick, and he heard voices, and so a lot of his work deals with themes of people who hear voices and stuff. And something that's interesting to me is that in one of his novels, the explanation for why people who have schizophrenia are paranoid was that people who have schizophrenia are telepathically sensitive to the negative intents of others. So when a person with schizophrenia, according to this sci-fi explanation, is in a crowd, they can feel all the negative thoughts that all the people in the crowd are having. So I feel sort of like that. It's an interesting theory to consider with voices. Is like some people are more sensitive to others than to hear voices. So when it comes to like a god or a demon or a ghost or whatever type of entity, and they want to talk to people, they look at people and they see, well, some people they're quite impenetrable to like get through to, but other people they can more easily, be talked to. It's sort of like a theory that I find interesting. Like, I played this video game recently. It's called Night in the Woods, and there's this main character in the video game. She has like a dream where she thinks she sees God, and she keeps seeing ghosts in her other dreams, and she says that it feels like there's ghosts inside her head. And so I sort of feel like that sometimes, like there's like other people inside my head, and they're sort of like these unappeased ghosts, and like so they weren't able to get what they wanted while they were alive, so now they're trying to get it through me. Now that's a complicated question for me, because first of all, one of the things that I own a copy of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the 5th edition is the one I own, and I've read it, and I've read about the process through which something becomes a psychiatric disorder, and I've read about the history of the American Psychiatric Association, and for example, homosexuality used to be a mental disorder, but then there was political lobbying, and suddenly it wasn't a mental disorder anymore. And, what happened wasn't, well, it was a mental illness, and then it just stopped being a mental illness. It was considered a mental illness by people, and then they stopped considering it a mental illness because it was no longer advantageous for them to do so. So with borderline personality disorder, it's a diagnosis that's primarily diagnosed in women, like 3/4 or 2/3 or something like that is diagnosed in women. And so it's sort of a controversial diagnosis in the sense that people with borderline personality disorder, there was this one study that was done, I can't think of the details, but like they showed these psychiatrists a clip of a woman who had an anxiety disorder having a panic attack, and then they told the psychiatrist that she had borderline personality disorder. And when they were told she had borderline personality disorder, they said that she was manipulative and she was attention seeking and she was doing it for all these malicious reasons, and as opposed to when she didn't actually have borderline personality disorder. So just the idea that someone could have borderline personality disorder causes a lot of mental health professionals to have this very negative stigma when they think of that disorder. So for a long time, I was very reluctant to thinking that I had BPD, because I had psychiatrists telling me not only was I faking hearing voices, which I knew I wasn't. I knew I was actually hearing voices. They would tell me I wasn't really transgender and I was just confused about my identity. They would tell me that I actually had a female brain because it's only a female brain that can have BPD, which was like a wildly untrue thing for that psychiatrist to say, because there are men who are diagnosed with BPD. So I had misgivings about that, and so for the longest time I was like, there's no way I can have BPD. I just don't have it. It's not something that I have. And then with my current psychiatrist, when he just said that I had BPD, I was really upset. Like, I've typed out a list of reasons I don't think I have BPD, and I handed it to him. So, like, I really tried to get him to consider that I did not have BPD. And he really tried to get me to consider that I do have BPD. And now the symptoms of BPD, they mostly aren't to do with, like, hearing voices and visions. Like, it's like, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, chronic feelings of emptiness, suicidal or self-harming behavior. And I have attempted suicide, and I have self-harmed. I do things impulsively. So I have to admit that some of the criteria does fit me. But so it just comes down to sort of a question of like like I am going to be diagnosed with this whether or not I agree with having it. So like I sort of feel like maybe at a certain point it's advantageous for me to just be like, well, this is a diagnosis that's part of my life whether I like it or not. But at the same time, there's part of me that feels like, well, it's this socially constructed idea of what this diagnosis is, and I'm not sure that it's like this independently real existing entity that I have. I think it's just a label sort of that I've been given that describes certain patterns of behaviors and experiences that I have. Vision of God had said it to me, and yeah, so I keep having these experiences where I play video games or I watch TV shows, and it's has a component that's like almost exactly similar to what I experience when I have the visions of God. I have this constant sort of belief that people are watching me or listening to me through my phone or through my computer. And on the one hand, I feel like, well, this is a paranoid belief and it's not true. But on the other hand, I feel like there's the possibility that it could be true, because it's not actually unheard of for people or the government or, to listen in to people's phone calls or people to hack into people's webcams. It does happen. So, whenever I hear about like the NSA or whatever, it's sort of, I have this paranoid belief, and then it sort of confirms it, and it's sort of like, so this isn't completely like far-fetched. This is theoretically something that could happen. So with that, I sort of feel like, like I try to tell myself it's not real, because I like to be able to use my computer in peace and not like worry about every conversation I have near my computer of like, oh, I just had a conversation about how the visions of God told me to kill the president, like now they're going to come after me. Like I try to tell myself, that's not going to happen. But at the same time, like, when I'm on my computer, I'm kind of like, is the sites I'm going on being monitored? Like, like, is this happening? So, like, it's definitely something that I feel isn't necessarily a delusion. Like, I feel like it has the potential to be true. Like, it's possible for people to listen in on people through their computers and phones. Whether or not it's happening to me specifically, it is possible as a thing to happen.
Has it ever crossed your mind that the people who may be listening to you or watching you through these technological devices could be the same people who are speaking to you, with the voices?
I haven't really thought about that, but I mean, it would sort of make sense. Like, I get this feeling sometimes, like, I used to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, because I've been diagnosed with a lot of things. When I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I was considered as having manic episodes as opposed to having psychotic episodes. And when I had these manic episodes, one of the feelings I had a lot was that everything was connected. Like, all the voices were connected and were coming from the same source, and everything in the universe was connected to each other, and, like, everything was just connected. And, this was, said to be a symptom of my manic episodes. And now, I'm no longer diagnosed with bipolar disorder, so I don't know how it is that I'm supposed to view the experiences that I had at that time, because, now it's like, well, you don't have bipolar disorder, so you didn't have manic episodes. But I did have those experiences, whether or not they're labeled as manic episodes or not. And so the thing that's weird to me is that I do this therapy, DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy, which is a therapy for borderline personality disorder. Every Wednesday I do it, so I'm going to do it tomorrow. And in this therapy, they were saying, you need to experience reality as it is. And one of the things that's true about reality is that you're connected to the universe. And so they asked everyone in the group, when was the last time you felt connected to the universe? And people were like, oh, when I go through nature or whatever. And I was like, the last time I felt connected to the universe was when I went off my medication and I was having what was considered a manic episode, and I just I was in Ontario. It was like the winter, and I just laid down in the snow, and I looked up at the sky, and I felt for certain that everything was connected. And I went through Wikipedia, and I looked at all these different dates, and I was like, the number 4 is a recurring theme. Like, everything was just connected in my mind to me. And, I felt like worried about bringing that up in the group because, I didn't want them to feel like I was encouraging other people to go off their medication so that they could feel more connected to the universe. But actually, it sparked a useful discussion because everyone else in the group, well, not everyone, but other people in the group were saying, yes, I've had similar experiences with my medication. Not with the feeling connected, but that, like, they gave me sort of advice, maybe if you wait a while or if you try different medication, you won't feel as suppressed by the medication.
What is your everyday experience of hearing voices now?
My everyday experience depends on the day, but they give me advice a lot about mundane things, sort of similar, I guess, the original form I experienced them in of the Holy Spirit. I make posts online about whatever, and they'll say, oh, you shouldn't, they'll say you should message this person, or you should send that email, or you shouldn't post that. So they give a lot of advice like that. I occasionally have the visions of God. They're mostly subdued now, which you could attribute to a variety of different things. One of them is that my psychiatrist challenged me to say no to the voices, just no matter what. And when I did that, I began to sort of realize that it's a slow process that I've been realizing, sort of with the help of the Hearing Voices group that I go to, which is that I have power over the voices instead of the voices having power over me. And so when I realized that I could say no, to the voice, the voice says, go to America and kill Donald Trump, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that because I'd only end up in jail. I'm not going to do that. Then there's only so much the voice can do. I began to realize that I could say no to the voice and there wouldn't be these massive negative consequences. So then the visions of God sort of subsided, I guess. And I've also been put on this medication, the Abilify, and I'm on Seroquel and clonazepam and prazosin as well. And I guess you could say the Abilify is helping, but I feel like it's more that I've changed my attitude towards the voices of there's a thing that they say in the voices group that I go to, which is recovery is about leading your life, not the life of the voices. And that is the idea that I kind of want to live my life by, through becoming a peer worker or going back to school or moving out. I'm not held captive by or a little puppet of the voices who has to do whatever they say, or else I'm my own person and I can live my own life, and I can say no if the voices tell me to kill myself. I can say no, I'm gonna remain alive. I've decided to do that. And so I feel like my relationship with the voices has changed. So I hear them and they're still there and they offer their perspective, and I'm like, okay, that's your perspective, but this is my life, so I'm gonna decide what I'm gonna do.
Would you be happy if the voices went away entirely?
I don't think I would be happy with that. I felt very alone. I remember when I was put in the seclusion room and the voice of God went away, I felt so alone. And I remember this patient I met when I was my very first ever hospitalization when I was in Ontario, and she said that they put her on, she had a stress-induced psychotic episode, so she didn't have schizophrenia, but she said they put her on 600 or 700 milligrams of Seroquel, and the voices just stopped completely. And she said, it's very lonely, but you'll get used to it. And it was interesting to me always that she said that, because she wasn't oh, I'm so thankful that the voices are gone, the suffering is over. She said, it's very lonely, but you'll get used to it. And I think about that a lot, because I know people who have negative voices and people who have positive voices and people who have both. But the thing is, like, I know that for me personally, even though I've had very negative voices and some positive voices as well, if the voices went away, even the negative ones, if they all went away entirely, it would feel very silent and it would feel very lonely and it would feel very wrong. So I've come to accept the fact that I hear voices, and I feel like there's other people that hear voices, both that I've met like at hearing voices groups or in the hospital, and I like feel like sort of proud to be part of this community, sort of like in the same way that like I feel proud to be transgender. Like there's interesting different historical figures who've heard voices, and so I think that you can be a person who hears voices and it doesn't make you a bad person. Like it's not a bad thing about you. So I sort of don't want the voices to go away because I feel like this is part of who I am. In the novel Valis, I'm not sure how to pronounce it because it's like an acronym, but VALIS. Um, there's this satellite that's like beaming information to him, and for example, it beams to him the information that his son has this medical problem, and it tells him in the exact technical detail the medical problem that his son has. And so then he tells the doctors, and then the doctors are able to fix it. And now the novel is fictional, but it's based on his own personal experiences that actually did happen. And so he had developed a bunch of different theories about why he was hearing this voice, and was it the voice of God? And like, so the theory in Valis is that it's called Vast Active Living Intelligence System. And so the idea is that there's like these beings like from another dimension or from another planet that communicate with humans using satellites. And throughout history, people have mistaken this communication for being God. And so that's sort of how God has communicated with us, has been through these satellites. So that's the theory sort of there that he had.
Could those satellites still be active and still be a part of why some humans, experience voices?
Well, it's a very interesting theory because the experience that Philip K. Dick had of like, he had the experience that he was able to know that his son had an ailment that he knew the medical terms for it and everything, and he knew that when he shouldn't have been able to know that. So the idea that he got that information from a satellite is an interesting idea, because if it was just like a delusion that he was having, it shouldn't have given him like correct information. Like it should have given him just like randomly generated information created by a chemical imbalance. So if it was a satellite, that would fit with the explanation that it was like actual information that was actually true and actually relevant. As for like, I don't know if I like personally believe that like satellites are communicating with me, but I mean there are a lot of satellites now, so like the explanation is almost more feasible now than it was at the time that he conceived of it, because now like with GPS and everything we have like so many satellites, so like that's definitely more of a thing that's happening now.